For as long as anyone could remember, Grendale had been a quiet, unremarkable town, tucked into a fold of forested hills where the wind carried the smell of pine and damp earth. Its streets were narrow and uneven, lined with brick houses whose paint peeled with age, and the river that cut through the center of town was more a mirror for the sky than a channel for commerce. Yet, beneath the veneer of rustic calm, there simmered a tension that had grown slowly, like a shadow stretching across the town. That shadow had a name: Leonard Marsh. Leonard had arrived one spring, years ago, with a slick smile and a charm that, at first, seemed almost harmless. But charm, in his hands, was merely a tool, a mask to conceal the brutality beneath. He had quickly acquired the old Miller barn and converted it into a private club, insisting that his business brought prosperity, while in reality, it became the theater for his dominion over the townspeople. He bullied, cheated, and manipulated, always confident that the law, distant and indifferent, would not touch him. The farmers who relied on him for grain delivery learned to nod silently as he berated them. The shopkeepers who traded at his store swallowed their protests when he found a flaw in their accounts. Leonard's power was quiet, insidious, like water wearing away stone. For years, the town endured his reign. A window broken here, a reputation ruined there, minor cruelties piling up into a mountain of resentment. People whispered in back rooms and behind closed doors, yet no one dared confront him directly. There were threats once, letters sent to authorities, the sheriff being implored to act, but Leonard's charisma and wealth made him untouchable. And then, one autumn, he crossed a line that would fracture the fragile silence forever. It happened at the school fair. Leonard, drunk on his own arrogance, cornered a young boy, Peter, the son of the local baker, and humiliated him in front of the entire town. It was cruel in a way that cut deeper than any previous abuse, and the boy's tears seemed to ignite something collective in the onlookers. That day, the town of Grendale, once paralyzed by fear, began to stir with a quiet, determined anger. It started subtly. A farmer left a gate unlatched, a delivery vanished without explanation, a horse spooked in Leonard's stable, costing him money. At first, Leonard laughed, dismissing the incidents as coincidences or minor annoyances, confident that no one could possibly organize against him. But as weeks turned into months, the pattern became impossible to ignore. His car would be found stuck in mud in the most improbable places. Meals delivered to him were mysteriously spiced with something foul. His phone calls were intercepted by an unseen hand, messages rearranged, threats anonymized but unmistakable. The town, once fractured into cautious whispers, now moved as a single organism. Meetings were held in barns and cellars, candlelight flickering over faces that had been stoic for too long. Old grudges and petty disputes were forgotten, replaced by a shared purpose. They did not speak of vengeance in dramatic tones. There was no fevered rhetoric or passion. It was methodical, precise, almost surgical. Leonard had built his empire on fear, and now fear would be returned to him, but quietly, invisibly, like the shadow that had always followed him. Winter arrived, and with it, the culmination of their work. Leonard, ever arrogant, failed to notice that the town he thought he ruled had become a labyrinth of eyes and silent actors. On a night thick with frost, he ventured into the woods behind his property, calling for someone, anyone, to join him in a private drink. No one came. The paths he took had been subtly altered. Signs, markers, and small barriers redirected him, guiding him deeper into the forest's heart. There was no struggle, no confrontation. Only the cold, the wind, the rustling of trees, and the feeling of being watched. The next morning, Leonard's house stood empty. Doors locked, windows untouched, his prized possessions in their places, yet he was gone. People searched, questioned, and ransacked the woods, but no trace was found, save for a single, faint imprint in the mud by the riverbank, a shoe, a pattern of steps leading into the water and then stopping, as if swallowed whole. Rumors spread quickly, as they always do in small towns. Some swore he had fled, others that the river had claimed him. But those who had orchestrated his disappearance never spoke, only continued life with the quiet satisfaction of justice served. Leonard Marsh, the man who believed himself above consequence, became a story told in hushed tones, a cautionary tale, a ghost. And Grendale, once oppressed and timid, flourished in the silence of his absence. The town did not celebrate. It never needed to. The simple act of reclaiming their lives, of walking the streets without fear, was celebration enough. Life returned to its ordinary rhythms, but with a subtle edge of pride, an unspoken acknowledgement that sometimes the most powerful justice is the one that moves unseen, leaving only the echo of its presence. Years later, children would play near the river, whispering of the man who had disappeared, and adults would smile knowingly. They understood that Leonard Marsh had been undone not by law, nor by force, but by the quiet, patient, and collective will of a town that refused to be terrorized any longer. For weeks after Leonard vanished, the townspeople moved through their days with a strange mixture of relief and unease. Relief because the oppressive weight had lifted, unease because the question lingered in every corner, every whisper. Where did he go? Some walked along the river at dawn, scanning the water for a flash of something out of place, a hint of the man they had collectively erased. Others avoided the woods entirely, as if the trees themselves had absorbed the memory of what had happened and might reveal it to those who dared enter. The baker, Peter's father, found a quiet satisfaction in kneading dough each morning, imagining the boy no longer carrying the fear he had grown up under. The old librarian, who had once flinched at Leonard's shadow when he demanded special privileges for his private club, now walked freely among the stacks, letting her eyes linger on the books she had once hidden behind counters for safety. Even the youngest children sensed the shift, though they could not articulate it. They played in the streets without glancing over their shoulders, laughing in ways they had been taught to suppress. Yet, Leonard's absence was not immediately triumphant. There was an emptiness, a strange void that seemed to pulse in the town's rhythm. His office sat untouched, his mansion still immaculate, as though waiting for him to return. Mail piled up, deliveries went unanswered, but the town no longer cared. The authority he had wielded so cruelly had been nullified not by law, not by confrontation, but by strategy, patience, and the quiet solidarity of the oppressed. And then, subtle signs began to appear. Windows that had been broken or boarded up slowly cleared, repaired by hands that had once trembled at Leonard's presence. Doors that had been kept locked during the day now swung freely in the wind. At the edge of the river, someone planted wildflowers, bright yellows and reds that contrasted sharply with the gray of frost and stone. Each act was small, almost imperceptible, yet they stitched together a fabric of healing, a reclaiming of space that Leonard's fear had once dominated. At night, some claimed they could hear strange noises coming from the woods, whispers that did not belong to any known person, footsteps that vanished before they could be traced. It was as if the forest itself had absorbed Leonard's presence, storing it, twisting it, making the air tremble with the memory of fear and power. Some elders swore they had glimpsed a shadow on the river, a figure too tall, too sharp, too deliberate to belong to any ordinary man. No one spoke of it openly, yet each nod in recognition carried the weight of a shared secret. The town learned to trust itself again, but it also learned caution. The collective act of revenge had been swift and effective, but it left a lesson unspoken. Power, when abused, does not vanish without a trace. Some nights, when the wind howled through the streets or rattled the shutters, the townspeople would instinctively check locks, glance at windows, and remember the tyranny that had once ruled their lives. Leonard's legacy, though invisible, lingered as a shadow against which the town now measured its freedom. Years passed. Children grew into adults and new families moved in, unaware of the intricate web of patience and strategy that had shaped the town's survival. The story of Leonard Marsh became a legend, recounted around fireplaces or at town fairs, each telling more dramatic than the last. But those who had orchestrated the final act never revealed the truth. They were careful to let the myth grow, knowing that sometimes Fear itself could serve as a reminder, a quiet deterrent against future tyrants. And still, on some evenings, when the sky was a bruised purple and the river reflected only shadows, those who had lived through Leonard's reign would pause, exchanging a glance heavy with memory. They understood the truth. Justice had been delivered, but it had demanded patience, cunning, and unity. It had demanded that an entire town move as one, invisible yet unstoppable. Leonard Marsh had disappeared, yes, but the town had changed forever, and its people carried a quiet, enduring power, the knowledge that when pushed too far, even the mightiest tyrant could be undone by those he underestimated most, the ones he believed too weak to act. Grendale returned to its rhythms, its market days, its slow dances in the town square, but it did so with a new heartbeat. It was a town that had faced cruelty, absorbed it, and returned it, not in fits of rage, but in precise, unyielding justice. And though Leonard's absence remained a mystery, one thing was certain. The town remembered, and it would never again allow fear to dictate its life. As years drifted by, Grendale seemed to settle into a peaceful rhythm, yet the town carried a subtle tension beneath its surface, like a cord stretched just enough to hum. Even as children ran freely along the riverbank, and market days flourished with laughter and chatter, certain nights reminded the older residents that the story of Leonard Marsh was far from over. It began with small, almost imperceptible incidents. Windows that had been shut tight were found slightly ajar, despite no one having touched them. Tools in the barns were misplaced, only to reappear in odd locations. A dog would bark furiously at nothing in the woods, then go silent, its fur bristling, eyes fixed on shadows invisible to any human. The people who had orchestrated Leonard's disappearance exchanged cautious glances, their instincts whispering that something they could not see was stirring. One evening, as the wind pressed cold against the town, Peter, the boy who had been humiliated so long ago, now grown into a tall, wiry man, stood by the river watching the dark water curl and twist. For a moment, he thought he saw a figure moving along the opposite bank, tall and deliberate, as if surveying him. He blinked, and it was gone. His heart raced, not with fear exactly, but with recognition. Leonard's presence had never truly left. It had merely dissolved into the edges of the town, waiting. Then came the letters. Unmarked, unsigned, folded neatly, and left in mailboxes or slipped under doors. They contained no words, only images, a pair of shoes in the mud by the river, a shadow moving past the window at night, the faint outline of a figure in the woods. No one could be sure if they were warnings, reminders, or hallucinations, but they were enough to make the hair stand on the backs of necks. The town, united once in quiet fury, now shared a creeping unease, a collective memory that refused to be silenced. People spoke less, moved more deliberately. Even as laughter returned to the streets, it carried a subtle edge, a cautionary note that the world, the town, and its secrets were not as simple as they seemed. And somewhere in the woods, hidden and patient, Leonard's legacy lingered, not as a man, perhaps, but as a force, an echo of fear and cunning that refused to die. Every now and then, someone would claim they saw him in passing, a flicker of movement from the corner of the eye, a reflection in a window, a figure silhouetted against the rising moon. It was impossible to tell if it was real, or merely the mind's trick, haunted by decades of memory and terror. But the whispers spread, as they always do in small towns. Leonard Marsh had never truly vanished. He had become a shadow, a phantom presence threading through the lives of Grendale's residents, reminding them of the fragile balance between peace and fear. And so life continued, measured and careful. The town had learned the price of silence and the power of unity. It had tasted fear and returned it with precision. Yet even in their reclaimed freedom, they knew that vigilance was their inheritance. For Leonard Marsh might have disappeared from sight, but he had left something far more enduring, the knowledge that evil, once rooted, could grow again if ignored. And in the darkest hours, when the wind moaned through the trees and the river seemed to whisper secrets, the people of Grendale would remember, and the shadow of Leonard Marsh would stir in the corners of their eyes, unseen but never gone.